Hello there. Welcome to Westside. We're glad you're here tonight. And if you're visiting with us, we're glad that you came our way. I encourage you to come back any opportunity that you have. We look forward to introducing you to some of our Westside family members or answering any questions that you may have about Westside. Hey, we have several people that are on our prayer list this evening that we do want to remember, so let me go ahead and get to that and get to some other announcements, and then we'll tell you about our devotional this evening. Michael Heath did have a biopsy today. Certainly want to remember him in our prayers. And also Joyce Ward had dental surgery yesterday. I'm not sure how that went, but certainly want to remember her in our prayers. Also, Suzanne Jennings is having surgery tomorrow, so please remember Suzanne in your prayers. Carmelita Garrison is having cataract surgery this Monday, February the 27th, so please remember her as she undergoes that. Also want to let you know Amanda Meyer's co-worker's husband, his name is Chris Jones. He has cancer, but he's been taken to MD Anderson. He's also, a couple of weeks ago, was taken to the ER at MD Anderson, I believe, as well. So I know that they're very concerned about him and want you to remember Chris Jones in your prayers, if you will. I know they will appreciate it. Some other announcements we want to let you know about. There will be a meeting this Sunday after morning worship in the foyer classroom for any ladies interested in helping with the Ladies' Day this year. I believe that's going to be in April, so if you'd like to help with that, please remember this Sunday in the foyer classroom following morning worship. Also, we will have a sandwich supper after evening worship this Sunday. So bring sandwiches and desserts. The chips and the drinks will be provided. If you can stay afterwards to help our children's Bible class teachers on projects for the upcoming semester, that would be much appreciated. And I know that would be a great opportunity to make a difference as well. The new adult Bible classes for the spring quarter will start next Wednesday, March 1st. The early bird class will have their final class next Wednesday. So if you've been going to that, please remember that. Also, anyone who would like to attend the OU versus Texas women's basketball game this Saturday, it's at 1 p.m. You can do so free of charge if you give me your name, and your name will be added to the pass list, and you can give your name at the southeast entrance by the men's practice facility at the Lloyd Noble Center. So if you want to go to the game free, let me know, and I'll add you to that pass list. But you got to let me know tonight, okay? So it's best if you catch me immediately afterwards. I'll be back there in the foyer before you go to class, and you can let me know. All right, remember tonight's classes. The Prophets, taught by Garrett Marshall, that is in the university room. Greg Giltner teaching the auditorium class on Nehemiah. And in the multipurpose room, Mark Green, daily discipleship, raising our faith ceilings. So remember that. And tonight, leading our songs, Garrett will do that. Leading our prayer is Keaton Fuchsa, and our devotional is Adam Hutcherson. Garrett.
Let's go ahead and stand for this first song. Walking alone at eve and the skies far, bidding the darkness come to a lovely silver star. I have a great delight in the wonderful scenes above. God is power and might is showing His truth and love. Oh, for a hope in God, a place His force to rest. Sure and safe abode with Jesus and the blessed. Rest for a weary soul, once redeemed by the Savior's love.
Let's pray. Dear God, thank you for this day. Thank you for everything you've given us. Please help everybody on the prayer list. Help everyone to have a safe trip home tonight. Thank you for this day you have given us to come here and worship you. And in Jesus' name I pray, amen.
You are Lord of creation and Lord of my life, Lord of the land and the sea. You were Lord of the heavens before there was time, and Lord of all lords you will be. We bow down and we worship you, Lord. We bow down and we worship you, Lord. We bow down and we worship you, Lord. Lord of all lords you will be. You are King of creation and King of my life, King of the land and the sea. You were King of the heavens before there was time, and King of all kings you will be. We bow down and we crown you the King. We bow down and we crown you the King. We bow down and we crown you the King. King of all kings you will be.
Good evening. If you will, please turn your Bibles to Matthew chapter 7. I'd like to start with a question tonight. For those of you who are legal drivers, have you ever been angered by another driver on the road? Whether it be cutting you off, speeding past you, or taking too long to realize that a light is green, chances are that the answer to the question is yes, if you've been driving for more than a week. I want you to think about what goes through your mind as that happens to you. You are probably responding with anger, laying on the horn, screaming at the driver even though they can't hear you, and maybe even talking to yourself about how dumb everyone on the road is except for you. Anyways, this is a pretty natural reaction for us as humans. I would even call it human nature to react in this way. If we see another person do something we perceive as wrong or dumb, then we are likely to react in some way. In other words, this is a way of judging others. In Matthew chapter 7, which is a part of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, Jesus tells us not to do this. But before we read that, I would like to get into some context of what judging is in our timelines. Let's start with the dictionary definition of judging. There are two definitions defined by the Oxford Dictionary. The first is a verb, form an opinion or conclusion about. The second definition is a noun, a public official appointed to decide cases in a court of law. For the purposes of this lesson, we're going to focus on the first definition. The culture around judging is also rather pronounced today. Our culture can be somewhat glorifying of judging others. Here's an example. You are walking down the sidewalk and you pass some people. The first person who walked past you is wearing raggy, cheap clothes, and the second person is wearing very expensive clothes. When you see the first person, you might think, wow, they need a new outfit. When you walk past the second, you think, wow, they are so vain. There is no way to please our mind when it comes to judging others. As humans, we will always be better at seeing the faults in others more than ourselves. That would be judging the outside, but it's even worse to judge the inside of others. Going back to the story about driving, when we see another driver do something stupid on the road, we are inclined to think that they are a horrible driver. However, when we do the same thing, we don't berate ourselves nearly as bad as we do strangers. In fact, we attempt to place blame on ourselves, place no blame on ourselves, and make excuses. We would say, the sun was in my eyes, or I drive a really old car. The truth is that this hypocrisy that is so common to human nature and that is also encouraged by our culture is exactly what Jesus tells us not to do in the Sermon on the Mount. Let's read starting in verse 1. Judge not that you be not judged, for with the judgment you pronounce, you will be judged, and with the measure you use it, that measure will be measured to you. Why do you see the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when there is a log in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. In verses 1 and 2, Jesus tells us not to judge, because if we judge, then the same measure will be judged to ourselves. This is expanded on in the rest of the passage, where Jesus criticizes those who judge and are hypocrites. To connect this back to the driving story, Jesus tells us to acknowledge and fix our own mistakes on the road before we judge and berate others. This is because we don't have a stake to judge, because we ourselves are flawed, just like the person who we end up judging. If someone is a bad driver, I would say they don't really have any room to judge if someone else is a bad driver. The truth is, we all have our moments and mess up on the road. All of us have made these mistakes on the road. We make mistakes, it's part of our human nature. Please turn to Romans 3:23. Reading there, for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. We all have sinned and made mistakes in our lifetimes, and therefore, according to Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, we have no standing to judge others. But further down on in Romans, Paul writes something more encouraging in chapter 6, verse 17. But thanks be to God that you who were once slaves of sin have become obedient from the heart to the standard of teaching to which you were committed. If you would like to put on Christ in baptism tonight or need the prayers of the church, please come forward as we stand and sing.
I haven't assigned a homework assignment, Jerry. Would you give me an idea?
No. It's been a long time since we've had to do homework, Stan. He's got a pulled hamstring. I start off tonight. I appreciate Philip filling in last week. I'm one of those guys when I'm committed, when I'm asked to teach a class, I'll commit to it. And then I've had to miss 2 weeks because of my heart issues. So I just need you guys to remember that coming up, I've got to have a heart ablation done. So it's similar to what Gary had done, but it's still one of those deals. I have an appointment next month to meet with the surgeon, and then we'll probably have the procedure in April. But I tell you that because until I have the procedure done, they've doubled my heart medicine, which extremely fatigues you. So that's last week I had some other issues going on, so I apologize. But it's nice to have a preacher that you can call and say, hey, Philip, not only do you need to teach a class, you got 3 chapters. And so I watched it at home, and he did a good job. He did great. He did a good job. This, we will finish tonight, Jerry, chapters 11, 12, and 13 of Nehemiah. I'm going to finish it, probably not the justification that it deserves because we're having to get a lot done tonight, but I will tell you this. This may be the end of this 13-week session, but I'm going to continue to study Nehemiah. That's how much I've enjoyed this study and this book. It's got so much application if you delve into it. I'm going to continue. That's going to be part of my daily study. Just a review. What I'd like to do tonight is do a review from where we have started at to where we are tonight. And then when I end up, time permitting, I'd like to give you all time to chime in with some applications or comments that you have found beneficial along the way. If we look at where we started in chapter 1, and this is going to be just a real quick review. We look at where we were at in chapter 1. Nehemiah has had his brother come to him and tell him about the city of Jerusalem and the terrible condition that it was in. Nehemiah was greatly distressed over that, and this is very early on in chapter 1. We see Nehemiah prayed, and he prayed about it for 4 months before he ever did anything. Every chapter since, there's a prayer that Nehemiah has prayed. He is a praying man, and that's going to continue into this lesson. But our first lesson was, does anybody really care? And keep in mind, Jerusalem had been in ruin for 70 years. There had been no preparation. There'd been some people come in and try to fix it up, but that didn't work. So I kind of had alluded to the fact that the people had just gotten used to the poor living conditions and just let it go. They just got used to it and didn't really fight it. And Nehemiah comes on board early on and changes their attitude. We see where he was appointed as a governor, and we know that was the case, so he could take paperwork with him as he traveled through these other areas and have safe travel. Although he had an army with him, he still needed those documents to have safe travel to get to Jerusalem. Then we see the mountain starts to move in chapter 2. We discussed where he starts where he brought in the timbers. He started rebuilding the wall with the materials that was already there. The stone that was there, the gates that were there, the things that were already in place in ruin. He encouraged the people, we need to do this. We need to rebuild. And he was able to do that. This is a people that came together to help him. Wall-to-wall workers was chapter 3. Then the workers became warriors. In that chapter, we saw where they had to strap on swords while they were working on the wall. Because if you remember, there were 3 governors in particular that had areas that surrounded Jerusalem. We talked about a guy by the name of Sanballat. His name will come up briefly tonight. We talked about a governor named Gershon, and then Tobiah was another one. Tobiah's name we will see tonight in chapter 13 as we close out, because he was one of those guys that was in great opposition about what Nehemiah did. But then after the walls were built, a priest allowed him to come in and live in the temple, which was against Jewish law. So Nehemiah actually kicked him out, threw his stuff out, and cleansed the temple. So Tobiah is that guy that we saw all along oppose Nehemiah, and then I guess Nehemiah gets the last joust in because he's the one that ousted him from his position and threw his things out of the city. Stop thief was in chapter 5, and that's where there was things that were taking place when the wall was being built. We've heard the enemy, and the enemy is a liar. That's where the governors had got with Nehemiah and tried to lure him out and convince him that, hey, we're on your side, only in a plot to kill him. V is for vengeance was chapter 7. Philip last week covered chapter 8, 9, and 10. In those chapters, he covered the people and the book, where Ezra actually got up and read from the book. And when he read, that took hours to do. And the people actually, I think Philip alluded to this, while he was up front, the people stood. It's kind of a honor thing, a respect thing. So while he was reading, Ezra read from the book, and this is where the people started, hey, we need to get back in God's good grace. Thus comes chapter 9, God's amazing grace. There's an amen. Chapters 11, 12, and 13. Chapter 11 we'll look at. I'm just going to grab some verses tonight that apply in each chapter, and then we'll have a conclusion. Chapter 11 is titled "The Shout That Was Heard Around the World." Now, once the wall is built, at this point in Nehemiah, the wall is done. The gates are done. They have this magnificent city at one time destroyed. Now it's been rebuilt. Now Nehemiah's job is to put worshipers, if you will. That's a highlighted word in my text. We've got the city, we've got the wall built so we can protect God's people who are there to worship. I need to get these people. I didn't realize until I got into the study, I would assume that people wanted to live in Jerusalem. People would want to be in the walls, and you'll see that they had to cast lots. Some of them are appointed to be there. The priests, the Levites, their obligation is to be there. But in order to have them there, you have to have temple workers. The Levites were supported by the people, so when we get in to chapter 12 and 13, where we talk about them bringing in tithes and support, that would have been for the Levites. There was a time that Nehemiah, between chapter 12 and 13, Nehemiah went back to the king because he'd been gone for a number of years. He goes back, and while he's gone, what takes place? They fall back. They start worshiping things they shouldn't. The big thing was, we'll see this in chapter 12 and 13, they started doing things on the Sabbath. They started trading with the Gentiles on the Sabbath. They could buy and trade and deal with the Gentiles, but they could not do that on the Sabbath. So they started doing that. So Nehemiah comes back to this total deterioration of what he had built. So have we seen that in history before? Yeah, what happened with Moses? Moses is gone, and what gets built? A golden calf. So there's a theme here. As long as the leader is there to encourage, as long as he's there to encourage them to move on, as long as he's there to have the singers, the worshipers, the workers, things went well. But as soon as Nehemiah left and went back, a place that he was actually in exile, but remember, he was a cupbearer for the king. He actually went back, and those years he was gone, they fell away. So there's application in there. So we're going to look at verses, just a few verses tonight as we go through the book. Once again, I encourage you to read chapters 11 and 12 have a lot of names in them. We've already read those names because those are names of people that was already told that they would come to Jerusalem. What we see now is they're actually being named out. You know, this group will be the ones living in the city. We have this group that's going to live in villages outside the city. So from a military perspective, Nehemiah has this city. He's got this wall that's built. Now he has to put people in it in order to protect it. Remember the last lesson I did, we talked about guards and watchmen, people that were actually on the wall and people that actually ran the gates. Remember when I mentioned a few moments ago that they started trading on the Sabbath. They started doing things on the Sabbath. Nehemiah stopped that. Guess what he did? He shut the gates on the Sabbath. They couldn't come and go. So if you want to stop bad behavior, you stop it at the source. If they can't go out and deal with the Gentiles, he just shut the gates on the Sabbath. So they had to stay within the walls. So as we go through chapter 11, 12, and 13, we'll see things like that Nehemiah now, in order to make, we have a city that can be protected because of the Great Wall. But now we have to have people in there to continue to protect it and watch it and make it grow. And that was done by casting lots, if you will. There was a certain percentage that were allowed in, and then everybody else. One of the words used in one of the commentaries was there were families that were drafted. So that sounds like to me they may not have wanted to go, but Nehemiah, you and your clan, you're going in the city. So let's go ahead and I'll just cover some stuff real quick here. Theologians remind us that God made the first garden, rebellious man built the first city, and the two have been in conflict ever since. If you stop and think about that. In the ancient world, cities were places of wealth and power. If you remember Jerusalem when it was first built, Babylon, you talk about these powerful cities. Now we look at modern times, in spite of their magnificence, too often our cities are bankrupt institutions famous for pollution, poverty, and crime. Complete opposite of where we were. So the walls are done. Nehemiah has to get the city inhabited. People with live bodies must move into the holy city. Some were drafted, some volunteered. The ones that were volunteered, you see, get some spatial recognition. Priests, Levites, temple workers, etc. The other thing I want to cover before we get into the reading, in chapter 13, we'll see three promises: the separation promise, the support promise, and the Sabbath promise that I've alluded to. So without reading, going into great detail on reading, I'll just cover a few verses, and I want to leave time for you guys to have some comments. So let's just start in chapter 11. In chapter 11, looking at verse 1. Now the leaders of the people dwelt at Jerusalem. The rest of the people cast lots to bring 1 out of 10 to dwell in Jerusalem, the holy city, and 9/10 were to dwell in other cities. So from a military standpoint, Nehemiah needed some inside and some outside. The ones on the outside could tell the ones on the inside, hey, this is coming, we can see this. The ones on the inside could protect because they had enough manpower, allegedly. So to bring 1 out of 10 to dwell, if we just look at that first statement, it wasn't enough just to see the city walls rebuilt and that spiritual renewal where we see Ezra stand up there and read the book and we see the commitment that the people made. It wasn't just enough to have that. Now they have to get more people into the city and get it populated. So just looking at realistic. For a city to prosper, for a city to grow, it has to be populated. There has to be trade. There has to be things in there that people can do to make money. There has to be commerce. There has to be a way for them to support families. So Nehemiah has all this on his plate. And keep in mind, I'm not going to cut Nehemiah short on anything he's doing in these last 3 chapters, because he had his entire trip planned out. From what he needed paperwork in hand to get through these governor's areas that were rebellious, to the amount of timber that he needed when he got to an area, to the amount of manpower that he needed to help get the wall erected and to get those gates done. So as we get to these last chapters, Nehemiah is definitely the man to pull it together, to see the city wither away after he rebuilt it, and then say, hey, we got to fix it. We got to fix it. Over a period of 80 or so years, it had been repopulated with a new temple built under Ezra, the walls rebuilt under Nehemiah, but we see the city still needed more people. Even though we had a wall that was able to withstand most enemies, you needed to have somebody on the inside of that wall that was able to defend. Nehemiah also knew that the bigger the population of Jerusalem, the greater the resources for defense and the strength in battle. So from a military perspective, he's looking at, how can I protect the city? What can I do? I have to bring more people in. So in a review, he didn't rebuild the walls just to see some conquering army come and tear it down. He built the walls because it was his passion. It was his calling to God, that I want to rebuild where my ancestors were. I don't want to see the ruins. So now the leaders of the people, we see in the second part of verse 1, the leaders of the people dwelt at Jerusalem. It was good that the leaders of the people set the example by living in Jerusalem. Refers to the leaders as the priests, the Levites, etc. They must set the pattern by their lives. They had no right to expect the people to live in Jerusalem if they themselves was not willing to live there. It's an awful hard sale for us, for me, to try to sell a piece of property in an area that's high crime rate if I don't have a fix for it. Hey, you're probably going to lose stuff when you get parked there. Your cars are going to be stolen. They'll break into your house. I don't have a fix for that. Nehemiah was not that guy. Nehemiah wanted his people to worship God safely and freely without fear. And in order to do that, it comes back to the leaders had to be willing to inhabit the city. So the 1 out of 10, that's a significant deal here. The rest of the people submitted themselves. They refer to it as a lottery system, where 1 out of 10 would be selected to move from surrounding regions into Jerusalem. So in the end, at least 10% of Judah's population would have been in Jerusalem. So 1/10 of the people, with most of them living on the outside. Yes? Right. I know. My guess is, Stan, and if somebody has a great answer, you're welcome to answer that question. My guess is, by the study, when I'm outside the walls, I have freedom. I can, if I want to go to Tracy's property and buy goats, I don't need any more goats. If you guys follow me on Facebook, I'm having babies every day. I need to sell some goats. But if I wanted to buy goats, I can do that. If I'm living in the walls, Stan, I can only do that on certain days, and I can't leave at certain times. I think it had to do with the restrictions more than anything. Absolutely. It would be a big move because they were already established in their villages or in their little region. And keep in mind, the walls have been rebuilt, the gates have been hung, but what is not completed on the inside? The houses. So if you move in, you're going to come into a place that's dilapidated, and you and your family's going to have to fix it up. So that's probably the bigger problem. But great question. So blessing the citizens of Jerusalem, looking on point 2 here. The people blessed all the men who willingly, okay, here's the point where the people that willingly offered themselves to come in. The people blessed all the men who willingly offered themselves to dwell at Jerusalem. Apart from the leaders who had spatial obligation, they had to be there. There were men who were willing to do that. They got spatial blessing because they volunteered. They had a unique pioneer spirit, if you will, the ability to endure. Stan, this goes back to your and my conversation, to endure hardship and discomfort to accomplish a greater work for God's kingdom. Where if I just stayed in my region outside, I could come and go and worship as I please. Now I still can worship, but I got to work. I got to build. I got to rebuild. And if I have a nice place or a place that's established, it's not exciting to go redo that. So it was in these days in the rebuilding of Jerusalem that God asked this important question of the prophet Zechariah. Who has despised the day of small things? That's in Zechariah 4:10. For who has despised the day of small things? The answer, many of us despise those days. But these who offered themselves to willingly live there with all that hardship, to take what is small and build it up for the Lord, had decided not to despise the day of small things. They decided to do what was right for the greater cause of the kingdom. Quickly going through chapter 11. To dwell at Jerusalem, it was a blessing. It was if such a blessing was reserved for those who willingly offered to live in Jerusalem, there had to be something special about the challenge of living there. So here's some things about living in Jerusalem. To live in Jerusalem, you had to reorder your view of material things. You had to give up land in your previous region and take up new business. So if I had a occupation outside the wall, there's a good chance I wouldn't be able to do that inside the wall. I would have to become a carpenter or something else. Secondly, to live in Jerusalem, you had to rearrange your social priorities, certainly leaving some friends and family behind in your old village. It's nice to know that if Jerry is my neighbor and I'm going to go out of town, hey, Jerry, we're going to be out of town for 2 weeks. I need you to watch the place, and it's watched. I move into Jerusalem, even though it's a nice city, nice place, I have to reestablish that. And this was a people, remember, that needed a lot of encouragement from the get-go because they were content to live in a mire. Yeah, David.
Well, there's one other thing, and it's in the 13th chapter. Some of these Hebrews had married outside, and these women, half of their children didn't even speak Hebrew.
Right.
They're not going to want to live in that.
Right. Yeah. David brings up an excellent point. That goes back to Ammon and Moab. They were not part of the group that was allowed to live in Jerusalem. But while Nehemiah was gone, they intermarried. They allowed their daughters to marry, and it goes back to the kids. So yeah, it got really mixed up. They called it, in the book, the study that I did, they called it the mixed multitude. And in order to get rid of that, Nehemiah went in and cleansed it. You're gone. And we'll see that coming up, but that's an excellent point, Dave. The third point, to live in Jerusalem, you had to have a mind to endure the problems in the city. It had been a ghost town for 70 years and was now basically a slightly rebuilt, somewhat repopulated ghost town. Was still not established. The city didn't look at all glorious, and it needed a lot of work. Fourth, to live in Jerusalem, you had to live knowing you were a target for the enemy. There were strong walls to protect you, but Jerusalem now was a notable city with rebuilt walls, the fear was that whole armies would band together with robbers and try to take it. So now we have this powerful city again, knowing that there's riches within that city, if you will. People are going to want to come and take that. As we see verses at chapter 11, verses 3 and following is a roster of people that lived in there. I'm not going to go through that at all. I will say this. As you get through that list down around verse 23 through 24 there, the heads of the provinces, this extensive list includes tribal leaders of the tribes of Judah and Benjamin, military men, priests, Levites, gatekeeper, civil and royal servants. Those who dwelt in Jerusalem, all these were notable men, and their families took the lead by choosing to settle in Jerusalem, setting a good example for all of God's people. So there's practical application for us today. We are sometimes called to go to a place. It'd be nice to be a missionary in Hawaii, but sometimes you get called to Somalia or whatever, right? Something totally different. So if your calling is to a place that you particularly weren't ready for, chapter 11, those last few verses tells us that the people did it for the better cause. And I think they get that encouragement. I see where they get their drive from a guy like Nehemiah that pushed them, a leader that was there with them and gave them direction. He helped on the wall. He carried a sword with them on the wall while it's being built. So if my leader is out front and he's got dirt on his hands and calluses on his hands, and I'm pretty sure they didn't have gloves, but if they did, they would have been wore out. He's right there with me, and he's calling the shots, and I'm protected. And here's the thing, I know God is with him because I've seen this man work. I've seen the great things. So Nehemiah has his people together. Now let's transition to chapter 12 real quick here. So we look at chapter 12. This is where we see the priest and the Levites. Zerubbabel comes into play here. There's a dedication ceremony. Early on in the chapter, they sought out Levites in all their places to bring them to Jerusalem. The Levites, when they came to Jerusalem, would have had many responsibilities in the life and worship of Israel. They were responsible when Nehemiah called people to be worshipers. It would have been the job of the Levites to make sure that that happened. One of the most important jobs that they had was to lead the people in songs of worship and praise to God. Now, I'm going to be honest with you guys. Singing is not my forte. So, Dave, I would not have been called to be a Levite. I could have been called to be a janitor and been just fine with that. Okay. I've told you guys before, God said make a joyful noise. What comes out of my mouth is a holy racket. So it is not, for people that sit around me, it is not pleasant, but they say God doesn't care. So my point is this. My point is this. When they had these singers, the singers had a very important role. The singers and the worship leaders, if you will, had a very important role because the same as in our service. When somebody gets up to lead singing, it's uplifting, it's positive. You have a group of people that come into the city every day and they have houses that need to be rebuilt, houses that need to be cleaned, fences that need to be rebuilt within the city, water system that needs to be taken care of. And then you have the worshipers on the wall singing, and that has to be a sweet incense, not only to them, but to God. So they celebrate. There's musical instruments at this point as part of the worship. But the sons of the singers, now this is another list. Sons of the singers had built themselves villages. They were specially appointed singers. The singers in Nehemiah's day had a close-knit bond, both by family and by living arrangements. Those singers would have been a vital role in the rebuilding. So since the jobs of these singers was to lead the people in worship, they had to be good singers, not like Greg, But more importantly, they had to be people of worship themselves. They had to be looked upon by the people as a good example. You can have a great voice. You can be a good singer and still be a bad example. In this case, they had to have a good reputation. Nehemiah made sure that the singers were somebody that was looked upon in a positive light. In chapter 12, about halfway through, it talks about the Levites and the priests. They had to purify themselves. That was their next step once they go through ceremonies. It says, without purity, we cannot worship God in spirit and truth, as Jesus commanded us. That's for us today. I cannot, without having been cleansed by the blood of Jesus, worship God. Nehemiah had that attitude then when he had to cleanse the temple and make sure that these people were pure. So the gates and the wall, finally their surroundings were purified. Nehemiah had made sure that that was taken care of. Purified surroundings help us walk in purity consistently. The homes and offices of many Christians could benefit from a purification and cleansing if that was still going on today. But Nehemiah made sure that that took place. So as we get to the end of chapter 12, and I say there's a lot of stuff that takes place in the middle there with people that are named and what their jobs were. You have this very large wall, and I think it was the first or second class, I put a map up and it showed all the different gates. Nehemiah and Ezra actually arranged people on the wall, if you will. They split the people up amongst themselves. You're going to go from this gate to this gate, and my people will be from this gate to this gate. So now when the worship starts and the singing starts, that's the shout heard around the world. It said communities, regions afar off could hear the Jews worshiping and singing, which is what Nehemiah wanted. He wanted to bring that worship back. So they appointed two large Thanksgiving choirs, is what it was called, two large choirs. All worship and praise must have a strong element of thanksgiving to God to be genuine. So the singers sang very loudly. It wasn't something that was done soft. They sang very loudly. They sang with rejoicing. They sang with great joy. Women and children also joined in and were included in that. So the joy of Jerusalem was heard from afar. Their worship was a testimony to anyone within earshot. Just the singing itself was a joy. So if we go back and look at Sanballat, Tobiah is already living in the temple, so he's not a threat right now, although he's a fox in the hen house, if you know what I mean. And then Gershom, those governors that live around, whatever they're doing at this time, and all of a sudden they hear the city of Jerusalem rise in song, rise in joy. Okay, they've watched this wall be built. They've watched the people move in and work. Now they hear songs of praise and joy. That had to be concerning to enemies. That had to be concerning to them. God's people are growing, they're getting strength. So Nehemiah is keeping that going. So there was some that was appointed for offerings, first fruits, if you will. So there was some that was appointed to take care of what was called a storehouse. This was a day of giving. People brought their offerings, their first fruits, and their tithes to the storehouse of the Levites. And they did it with joy because they enjoyed supporting the priest and the Levites ministering on their behalf. Priests and Levites, if you will, did not have a job or a means of income. It's what the people brought them. So they brought it willfully. So we can translate that today. God loves a cheerful giver. It's kind of along those same lines. Both the singers and the gatekeepers kept the charge of their God and the charge of purification. So it was a day of purity, an ongoing concern, not a one-time ceremony. So the consecration, if you will, the Levites and the priest were a great part of it. As we move into chapter 13 real quick, and I want to take time towards the end here for your comments, but as we get into chapter 13, this gets into where Dave had brought up the fact that we have people not supposed to be, because of their descendants, because of their nationality, if you will, the Ammonites and the Moabites, they were not allowed this covenant. But yet we see the Ammonites and the Moabites were singled out because of their devious schemes against Israel when Israel came into the promised land, and that was what, thousands of years before. So long before the Ammonites and the Moabites had that scheme against Israel, God made a promise to the father of the Jewish people, Abraham. This is in Genesis 12:3. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse them who curses you. Ammon and Moab cursed. That's where God is directing that verse. Our God turned the cursing, though, into a blessing. Refers to events from Numbers chapter 22 to 24, where God blessed Israel, even though the prophet Balaam wanted to curse them. Reminds us also today that God's able, more than able, to turn any curse into a blessing. So even through difficult times that we've seen Nehemiah have, and all the obstacles he's come up against, there were still times that it was a blessing to do God's work. I'm going to jump back because I'm running out of time here. I want to jump back to a little bit about what Dave said. I want to go back to Tobiah. So about the first 9 or 10 verses, I came to Jerusalem, this is Nehemiah. I came to Jerusalem and discovered the evil that Elijah-bib had done for Tobiah. When Nehemiah came back, he saw that Elijah-bib the priest had entered into agreements with one of the enemies of Nehemiah, which was Tobiah. Tobiah was an Ammonite. We saw that in chapter 2. One of the very mixed multitude that had been put out of the assembly about 10 years previous. At this point, Tobiah was not only present among the assembly, he actually rented a room in the temple courts. Highly, highly offensive, if you will, to Nehemiah for Elijah-hib, the priest, to have done that. Apparently, Tobiah had not changed over the years. He did not join the people of God in the terms of his covenant. The problem was evident to Nehemiah, but Elijah-bib was completely blind to it. Whatever agreement those two had, Elijah-bib turned the other way. And it grieved Nehemiah bitterly. So here are the reasons why he was so distressed. It grieved him because rooms in the court of the temple of God were being occupied by a man that was not only a pagan, but who had an active history of trying to oppose Nehemiah the whole time the wall was built. Secondly, it grieved him because it reflected so badly Elijah-bib, a man who was a spiritual leader in Israel and to those around him. It showed that Elijah-bib was blind to a problem area, and also that no one around him could confront him with the problem. He was unapproachable. It grieved him because it made Nehemiah question the lasting value of the spiritual revival he had witnessed when he was last in Jerusalem. Therefore, I threw all the household goods of Tobiah out of the room. Nehemiah wasn't one to just sit there and grieve about it and say, I can't believe they did this. Why would they do this? He actually acted on it. He threw all of his goods out that had occupied the temple courts. He ceremonial cleansed the rooms. He put the rooms back for their proper use, which at that time they were to be used as storerooms for sacred things of the temple. So that was another slap in the face. The room that was given to Tobiah, the enemy, was a storeroom that was supposed to secure sacred things of the temple. And that is what got Nehemiah upset. So, as you finish out chapter 13, it talks about it talks about giving. It talks about the Levites again. It talks about the singers again. Nehemiah set the situation right by expecting the Levites and the singers to recommit the work of serving God and his people as they should. He also reorganized the collection and accounting and distribution of the people's tithes and gifts. While Nehemiah was away, that went by the wayside. They just let it go. There was no accountability, if you will. Nehemiah completely changed that. So, I mean, if we look at application today, going back to what I said earlier about when the leader is there, let's go back to, when my boss is around, I tend to work a little harder if he's watching me, right? The boss is gone for 2 weeks. You should go ahead and work just as hard. Some people don't. At one time, I had a camera in my office and I could prove that they didn't work as hard. But in this case, Nehemiah came back. Okay, he was grieved in chapter 1 because of the condition of the city. And now he comes back after being gone, possibly 10 or 12 years. And they had deteriorated it again. And now he's having to rebuild it, not the walls, rebuild the people within, cleanse, get rid of the riffraff, get rid of the unclean, get rid of those that were not supposed to be there. And he starts with the Levites and the singers to make things right. So I wanted to get down to the Sabbath, because I mentioned there were three things that there were three promises. The Sabbath was being ignored in disobedience to God's clear command under the Old Testament. On the Sabbath day, when they were supposed to rest and trust God, foreigners sold and the people of Israel bought. At the root of the problem were the priorities. There was nothing wrong with buying and selling, only when the desire to buy and sell or to spend and make money became more important than honoring God. And that's where that they slipped over that line. This was clear that this was a clear way the people of Israel put making and spending money before God. So we see the New Testament makes it clear that we're not under the same law on the Sabbath, obviously, but Colossians 2:16, we are to certainly be under the same obligation of honoring God more than we are about making money and spending it. So that was where Nehemiah decided to, you know what, if the people are going to go outside the gates on the Sabbath and they're going to do things they're not supposed to, I can stop that. So that's where in this chapter we see he closes the gates on the Sabbath. We have went through 13 chapters of the book of Nehemiah. We have witnessed a great leader. I've always looked at Nehemiah, Dave. I probably read the whole book at some point, but not in detail. But when you start looking at this man, he was a tremendous leader, not a spiritual leader, but he was also that type of a leader that could encourage others to do things when they didn't want to do it themselves. So he was able to do many great things for God, and he always gave God the glory for that. Every chapter we see Nehemiah prayed. In every chapter he prayed multiple times. I think there's a message for us today. We don't just pray when I have a need. I don't just pray when I'm sick. I need to pray often about a lot of things. I'll be quiet. Any comments? I know you guys have had great comments in the past. Any closing comments about the book of Nehemiah? I know.
That's why we just spent 70 years in
I know.
captivity.
I know.
But it's a lesson to me in that, certain things tempt me that don't tempt you. Certain things tempt you that don't tempt me. But
things that try to draw me away from God, if I'm not careful and I don't continue my faithful worship and coming and doing, before I know it, I've backslid off into
Right.
something, and maybe not crazily, but just in terms of thoughts or anything else. And so, but when these people are living their lives and see that speaks volumes
It does.
to me of how much God had given them. And then I don't know how long Nehemiah was gone, but it doesn't sound like it took very long
Right.
to do this. And so I think that's probably a lesson for all of us.
Stan, I had mentioned a couple of weeks ago about a punch card. You know, sometimes I'm here on Sunday, I'm here on Sunday night, I'm here on Wednesday night, I've done my deal. We're not into it. I think this is a case where the people just got complacent again. And unless we have that desire to continue to worship like we should, and that worship becomes with our singing, it becomes with our offering, every part of that aspect. When we do as we should, we stay engaged. Yeah, Tracy.
I noticed that many times, not just in chapter 13, but multiple occasions, he says, "Remember me, oh my God, and have compassion on me." And I think it's a natural thing for many people to think about what is your legacy. And to me, I think he's saying, "This is my legacy. This is something that God has put for us."
Yeah.
That's the most important thing, is what we do for God.
And I'll read what you just referenced. At the conclusion, at the very end, verse 31, the last part of verse 31, at the end of it all, Nehemiah knew he did his best to make the people of God strong, make them safe, and make them secure. Beyond that, he'd also led them to be pure, worshipful, and obedient. And then he makes that statement, "Remember me, O God, for good." I like Nehemiah's direct approach when he talks to God. There's no guessing what his intent is. Nehemiah certainly carried a sense of failure, but in Nehemiah 10, the people made a solemn covenant to God that they would do 3 things, and they did not, and he held them to it. Remember me, O God, for good. Guys, thanks for your 13 weeks. I know some of it was spent in some other classes because of a series, but love the book. I would encourage you to continue to study Nehemiah, as he's a great leader of faith and courage. Thank you.